Professor Parida, Professor Manoranjan Parida, who is currently a Deputy Director in IIT Roorkee. We welcome Dr. Girish Agarwal for this session. And currently he is with Zindal Global University. He's a professor in the School of Art and Architecture. Over to you, Girish.
Good morning, everyone. Since Kalga has already given my capsule bio, I don't need to say any of that. What I'll talk about is what we found in terms of work done around looking at how the legal and institutional framework affects safety, right? Or can affect safety. So what is the information we found, not in terms of the specifics of that, but as everybody else has been talking, that looking at what papers exist, what work exists, in what area, and what that is focused on. So the protocol on looking for the work was we looked at what is the impact of insurance policies, what is the work being done around looking at vehicle taxes, right? What are the fuel and road pricing? So these are the interventions, central government research institution, laws addressing road traffic, right? And the outcomes that we are looking at, primary outcomes, the same pattern is, let me preface it by saying that the same pattern is being followed in all sections of the EGM, right? Fatal crashes, crashes where there were severe injuries but non-fatal, right? Change in use of seat belts, change in use of helmets, change in alcohol or drug use, change in speed, right? They're all included as part of the outcomes we consider for the legal and institutional framework, because statutes and policies potentially can affect all of that, or at least we think it can, right? The features we looked at in pricing, we looked at vehicle taxes, road pricing, congestion pricing, fuel pricing, right? Because there's the idea that change in fuel prices can affect how much people drive, right? Though I'm not sure how much difference does that make in a country like India, right? At least in personal vehicles, I don't think people are that influenced by change in fuel prices, but we don't know. That's an aspect that needs to be looked at. Same thing with congestion pricing. It has been tried in parts of the world, has never really, so pricing is one of the features. Like I said, vehicle taxes, road pricing, congestion pricing, right? And fuel pricing. These are things that can be affected by, at the state level, central level, even municipal level, right? The government changing its policies, new legislation which can impose taxes, right? You can have direct taxation, you can have it in the form of pay-as-you-go pricing, right? Congestion pricing works usually as a pay-as-you-go. Another feature that we included in hunting for work as part of the EGM was safety institutions, right? What are the central agencies? I tend to talk with this. What impact do central agencies have, right? What impact do research institutions have, right? Is there any work on that? Looking at motor vehicle insurance, right? The effect of no-fault insurance for automobile drivers. The automobile insurance in India is by default now no fault, right? Financial incentives in insurance, that if you have no crash history, right, do you get a discount in your insurance premium, right? Currently, I think it's capped at about 50% of your premium in India. There's also talk of looking at driving patterns, how much do you drive, and change insurance. Right now, insurance rates are not affected by that, right? Laws and policy directly, that helmet laws, seatbelt laws, right? Laws requiring protective technologies in vehicles, anti-lock braking systems, daytime running lights, right? What research is available in that area, right? So we found a total of 424 studies that focused on interventions that are related to legislation, right? Only 35 of these 400 some were systematic reviews and 389 were impact evaluations, right? Keep in mind that every time we do something more on that, these numbers change, right? More studies get looked at. So the particular aspect these studies looked at, an overwhelming number were law and policy, right? So 406 of the 424 studies had a law and policy component. So, like I said, an overwhelming majority of the studies only look at, not only but predominantly look at law and policy, right? About 5% of the studies looked at pricing, right? And 4 each looked at safety institutions and vehicle insurance. And keep in mind that these are studies on a global scale, right? This has not yet been broken into looking at low and middle income countries or high income countries, right? So, which gives you a window into what the current crop of researchers thinks is important, right? That looking at law and policy is the primary concern and looking at pricing, safety institutions, insurance issues is not, right? Study designs predominantly before and after and time series analysis, right? Which I promised Geetam I will not make disparaging remarks, but I think it's the math obsession of saying, yes, I know math, when people jump into time series for no apparent reason. All of the interventions on all 4 axes were looking at fatal injury, fatal and severe injury crashes as the outcomes to be considered, right? Law and policy studies, which is the predominant set of studies, right? A number of them looked at what we are calling intermediate outcomes, which was beyond injury and death, right? Change in speed, change in alcohol use, seatbelt use, helmet use, right? Again, yes, the numbers are double digits, but given that we are talking of 400 plus studies, right? Out of a starting pool of close to 250,000, right? It's not very much. In absolute terms, it's next to nothing, right? If you look at it graphically, right, gives you a much better mental image of what the relationship is, that the primary focus is law and policy. Within that, what gets most talked about is death and injury, right? And what is least talked about is the effect of law and policy on change in speed, right? Which is the indirect way of telling you that most people doing these studies don't consider regulatory speed limits anything worth looking at, right? Which if you look at accidents in India, right, you do realize the speed is a contributing factor, right? Again, like I said, 95% of the studies are in high-income countries, right? What from the sub-pool of 400 some studies, right, we could only locate 4 impact evaluations and 2 systematic reviews which talked about low and middle income countries, right? And all of these focused on law and policy, not on the other aspects, right? If you look at the regional distribution of studies, right, 2/3 of them were from North America, right? And then another, basically a third, if you look at Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, and Pacific, right? almost all of these, they had already said, from high-income countries. Right? So there is very little work looking at the impact of legal and institutional framework on road safety in any low to middle income country, not just India. Right? Same thing, just I plotted the regional disparity just to give you a visual image that the blue bar, which is mostly not visible except in law and policy, right? Low-income countries, low to middle-income countries, right? And high-income and upper-middle-income countries is where the bulk of the studies were. And predominantly, even that, if you were to look at a higher granularity, is in high-income countries. Okay. The distribution of looking at how many studies looked at motorized transport, how many studies looked at non-motorized transport, right? In India, if you look at the numbers, even if you just stick to fatalities, right, a huge proportion of people dying on the roads are non-motorized, right? People walking, people riding bicycles, right? And if you segregate the motorized into two-wheelers and others, right, another about a third of the people dying on the roads are motorized two-wheeler riders, right? So in the context of countries like India, one could in principle look at motorized transport segregated out, right? Globally, again, you can see the disparity. Right? The number of studies on non-motorized transport are very small, right? Keep in mind, we're only talking of legal and institutional framework issues, so basically laws and policy. Right? This is NCRB's data. I just clipped it out of a newspaper. After Cyrus Mistri's death, every newspaper had these NCRB graphics, right? Which somehow giving you the impression that if only we were to make seat belts mandatory everywhere, right? The 150,000 would miraculously vanish, right? I did not, so far at least, I might have missed some, haven't seen a single newspaper report saying that really not that many people sitting in cars die, right? As a proportion out of the 150,000 who die. So where should our policy be focused on? Would seatbelt be that critical, or would making a collapsible bumper that when it hits pedestrians, they don't instantly die, right? Would controlling speed be more critical so that you don't transfer a huge amount of energy to people that you hit on the street, right? Or would providing a car with 7 airbags, as Gadkari has been going around saying for the last 2 days, right? If only we had 7 airbags, right? So that is, right. Like I said, the lack of studies is not really surprising, right? Not just because for whatever reason we might claim we don't have the capacity to do research in that, but because there is no legislation, right? If you don't have road safety legislation, what are you going to study, right? So India has no specific road safety legislation, right? If you cobble together all the laws that indirectly impact road safety, right, it'll take maybe 200-300 words which will cover every law that mentions safety even indirectly, right? So I just, beyond the EGM, I'm just talking a little bit about this, that we have no statutory protection, right? We have some indirect statutory protection through provisions of the criminal law, right? Most of you know that every time there's an accident, right, the provisions that the police charges anyone under, if they charge, are criminal law provisions, right? There is no civil law equivalent for things that don't involve bodily harm, right? If I hit a light pole, if the police wishes to charge me, they have to bring in a criminal destruction of property charge. Right? They do not have something that comes out of the motor vehicles code or elsewhere which would make it a civilian charge, right? Which would be a civil case. Motor Vehicles Act, the amendment which was much in the news a couple of years ago, right? Which was supposed to rationalize and improve road safety, doesn't really do anything of the sort, right? I'll talk a bit about that later, but just transferability issue. Question was raised during the first session on what Matthew was talking about, that the studies that we are looking at, that before we lament too much that there are no studies in LMICs, why not use studies done in high-income countries, right? So that's a transferability issue. We did look at that for all of the access, right? Again, like I said, for law and policy stuff, right, transferring is very problematic. Right? One, because there's a compliance issue. Right? If I have road safety regulation, it doesn't mean anything unless I have compliance. Right? Compliance also implies enforcement. So either the compliance and enforcement mechanisms need to be in place. Right? Like Dinesh loved to point out all the time that having a policeman and a police vehicle standing at a red light at an intersection is far more effective than having four police vehicles trying to chase down offenders and issue them tickets. Right? They're just a presence, and it's an understood thing, right? But it has never really been brought into force in the sense of any institution, whether the police or the legislature, looking at it as a legitimate tool. Right? Then evaluating legislations, right? Even the studies that are there, right? High-income country studies, when they're evaluating legislation, mostly they don't talk about the level of enforcement, right? So if, let's say, if I have a study from Southern California, right, which says that speed limit through LA was changed from 30 miles per hour to 20 miles per hour, and the next 3 years, statistics, the accident numbers started dipping, right? There's a background assumption that their audience, whether it's a layperson, researcher, or policymakers, know about the enforcement level in the background, right? But there is no direct connection in the study talking about how levels of enforcement affect that, right? Which is a major issue. What is the point of traffic legislation if it's not going to be enforced, or if it's unenforceable for other reasons? Those studies are needed, right? Everywhere, whenever we change speed limits, right? Even if we change something as simple as, say, making a free left turn into a left turn where you have to wait for the light, what is the impact, right? Most of it seems to be done on an ad hoc basis without any solid evidence behind it. That does it make a difference? What difference does it make? Right? All of those studies are needed. Right? Transferability is also problematic because straightforward that legislation in any country, is not context-free, right? There's a whole string of existing laws and policies in which any new statute will fit in, right? So you can't just say that this worked in Canada, right? And even in Canada, say that this worked in Toronto, will this work in Mumbai, right? There is no direct way to make a comparison unless you have equivalent studies and data from Mumbai, right? If we had that, then yes, one could look at intermediate-sized cities and say, okay, this in Toronto can be compared to this in Bombay, and maybe we can extrapolate to other cities. But when you don't have any baseline studies, right, how are you even going to start working on a comparison? Right? again, the enforcement issue, I'm just repeating the enforcement point because that is a critical thing, right? What level of enforcement, what kind of enforcement, how do you actually implement things, how do you make things stick? Right? All of those can have an effect. Right? At this point, I mean, besides anecdotal issues based on personal experience, based on talking to people, we don't have any large study that would tell me something as basic as, do highway on-off ramps cause accidents? Right? The way our highway on-off ramps are built, right? Suddenly you have a high-speed 120 kmph structure rising out of a space where traffic rarely moves past 20 or 30, right? And a mix of traffic climbs onto the highway. What happens then, right? There is no systematic study on that. So saying things like, I will enforce highway access or I will enforce highway speeds is meaningless without having something to say that what effect is that going to have. Right? So back to what I was saying about the Motor Vehicles Act. Right? The modified version, the only relevant things in there are some speed limits. Right? Otherwise, the licensing regulations and change in licensing regulations. Right? For those of you, I'm not going into the details of the Act, but yes, in some cases it makes it convenient to obtain or renew a license, but it has nothing to do with safety. Right? Licenses anyway have nothing to do with safety. Right? Just the fact that I have a government-issued piece of plastic does not guarantee anything that I'm a better driver than the other person who doesn't have one of these pieces. Right? The purpose of a license, I think, is generally misunderstood. It has nothing to do with driving skills. Right? It's the equivalent of a state card for different purposes. Right? Section 138, existing part which is very relevant but never used, which empowers local governments, right, to prevent motor vehicles from being parked randomly, right, which if actually implemented and used can have very wide interpretations in terms of providing for greatly enhancing road safety for non-motorized traffic, right? Pedestrians, bicyclists, even two-wheelers. Right? Simple things like, if you read the law as it is, it basically says that parking on the street anywhere is illegal, unless there's a sign that says municipal corporation parking. So whether you're parking in front of your house or your neighbor's house or in the market, you're committing a crime. Right? Your vehicle can be towed, you can be fined. Right? What is the current fine is 2,000, and it's not a one-off. So if a policeman goes by 20 times in a day, they can, in principle, fine you 20 times. Right? You're occupying land, so it's also encroachment. If they feel like it, the police can also add encroachment charges. Right? So every time your vehicle is on the street and not moving, right? So all the signs that people put up parking for such and such only, right? All that is meaningless. If it's outside your property boundary, it's illegally parked. That's what the law is, right? Not really an enforceable law, we know that, right? But there has not been any work done on saying what would work. How would you handle the parking situation in cities, right? How are you going to enforce that? Given the political and structural realities of our bureaucracies, right? We don't know. I can have my ideas and I can yell and scream about it, but unless I have data to back it up, unless I have some kind of evidence to back it up, right, it's meaningless. So these are vast areas where a lot of research needs to get done, right? So the sidewalk thing I love, I just bring it up. Even in a structural analysis class I was teaching, somehow I dragged it in, talking about potholes and people falling into them, because this broadly covers all of that, right? Just a quick listing of the criminal law provisions that come into play whenever there's injury, right? All of these are the same as when you get into a fight with someone and the police charges you. So just to keep in your heads that how am I going to take a study done in the US about the effect of certain statutes and apply it in a situation where I don't have any equivalent statutes, right? Where I'm dealing with a system which operates very differently, right? So unless you have, this is one area where you definitely need local studies, right? A lot of local work is needed, right? Even something as simple as I cannot go into a library and get information on what has been, that when rash and negligent driving is applied, right? Yes, we like to claim that there's a socio-economic divide, that it gets applied in certain cases, but I cannot give you an algorithm which says this is when it gets applied, right? This is the kind of vehicle and person who is likely to get charged, who is not likely to get charged, right? Not an engineering problem, right? More something, I want to say cultural and social anthropologists, but I know we have a couple of anthropologists in the audience who might object, right? But let's just say it's an urban studies problem, right? It's not a core engineering or safety engineer problem, but those need to be looked at, right? We need to understand what would be the impact of different kinds of legislation, right? I think I'll just skip this. This is just talking more of, right? In terms of policy, same thing, that very few of the existing studies, yes?
Last 5 minutes.
I'm done, actually. I can just go on this indefinitely, so if people have questions.
She's my colleague, and I think she's currently the head of the TRIP Center.
And I will just take off from where both Matthew this morning talked about evidence gap map in pre-hospital care. And before that, we had shown you that we had worked on 6-7 different topics. Girish talked about legal aspects. So I will walk you through what we have found in this project, evidence gap map, specifically related to road infrastructure and traffic controls. So in this topic, basically infrastructure becomes, after all the understanding and working for almost 3-4 decades on this topic, and also very closely with Professor Mohan, if I have to say one really major aspect which has influences on our driving and traffic safety is road infrastructure. Why that happens? Because the road infrastructure that any road user is using influences our behavior in many ways. In crash avoidance, because whether we are driving at an appropriate speed or not is largely determined by the kind of road we are driving in. If we have a straight, wide road, no matter how much safety training we have, we tend to drive fast. We don't worry about the speed limit. Same user, same vehicle on a narrow road will drive differently. It encourages pedestrians and bicyclists to use the safe path while moving crossing the road, provided our design meets their requirement. So if the pedestrian path or bicyclist is convenient for pedestrians and bicyclists to use, it's comfortable and convenient, then they will use it. Else they will not use it. Avoiding head-on collisions and 90-degree collisions, this all comes by road design. And then at the time of crash, also it has a huge role to play. The severity of crash can be reduced by road design. How we design our protective infrastructure, how we design our intersections, all this actually has influence on severity of injury. And I'll quickly walk you through some examples. And it manages the absorption of crash energy through various designs of crash barriers and road cross-section. So this we have seen in the morning. It is a huge problem for low and middle income countries. We know 93% fatalities are lying here. There are many countries who have already been successful in reducing this public health crisis, mostly high-income countries. But unfortunately, highways generally in low and middle income countries, and certainly in India, have not become safer after upgradation. And we have been documenting these numbers, that the new highways that we have been doing, going from 2-lane to 4-lane, and 4-lane becoming 6-lane, and now expressway, when we look at the rates, they have been increasing. So this is a major concern, because one of the outcomes we expect after upgradation is improvement in safety, not just speeds. Pedestrian fatalities form a very small proportion in high-income countries on highways. This is not true in countries like India. And the numbers that we have seen, even on our highways, we have ranging from 20 to 40% deaths on our highways are pedestrians who are not expected to be there. And obviously, our traffic mix is different. So this is an important area that we should be looking at. So in this evidence gap map, especially looking at infrastructure and traffic control, we looked at these 7 different aspects of road infrastructure, and especially the outcomes we were looking at, influence on fatal crashes, non-fatal crashes, and change in speed, which is an intermediate outcome. Now for each one of them, actually together if I add, there were 24 different features which were included in the study. So I will not read out all of them, but for example, when we talk about protective infrastructure, this is important for our highways, because guardrails included design of longitudinal highway barriers, which are designed to reduce the impact of run-of-road collisions, crash cushions, roadside safety treatment. These topics were included. And other few features which were important, again, for countries like India, bicycle lanes, powered two-wheeler lanes, motorized two-wheeler lanes, footpaths, footbridges, pedestrian tunnels, etc. So if we add all of them, 24 different features were added in our review. So first outcome that we see, and here I'm only, even though in our evidence gap map we did look at systematic reviews, impact evaluations and other studies, but impact evaluations are included in systematic review, so I'm presenting details of impact evaluations. And we find that majority of the studies are on road design, urban forms, speed control, traffic control, and very few studies on bicycles, motorcycle lanes, pedestrian paths, protective infrastructure also. There are few studies on this. So this is a gap. In terms of study design, large number of studies are before and after studies, and we did not include what we call naive before and after studies. These didn't have certain kind of controls, only those were included. But however, in public health, we do have many other more robust study designs, which actually take care of confounding factors. These are not so common in traffic or traffic safety studies. It is just becoming, people have started using these better designs now. So hopefully in future years we will see more of these. But as Professor Ezra Hauer has warned in his publication, that in general in transport, naive before and after studies in safety impacts are very common. So we should watch out for that we don't start using those results. So again, we look at the divide. Where are these studies being done? Which part of the world? So we find that in general, like other topics you have seen, low-income countries and low and middle-income countries, very few studies. In this bar, the dark blue and the yellow portion that you see is basically North America and Europe. So large number of studies have been done in these countries. And so I think there are two issues we need to understand here. Studies are being done in other countries. Is it that the quality or the study design did not meet our inclusion criteria? So we need to improve the quality of the studies which are being done. And second, of course, the transferability is weak, and we will raise specific questions regarding that. Again, we also try to look at the divide between motorized and non-motorized vehicles. And we know in low and middle income countries, it's the impact on non-motorized vehicles is extremely important. And again, we find if you just compare for each of the topics, in general for non-motorized traffic, which is bicycle, pedestrian, etc., fewer studies. In terms of urban and rural divide, almost equal number, so that's not a major concern. Okay, let's talk about transferability of results. And there are two major concerns here. First, majority studies are in high-income countries, which is okay, because the scientific principles are universal. So that should not worry us too much. But what is different? Our traffic, which means in low and middle income country traffic, mix is very different. It is dominated by presence of pedestrians. Even our motorization in countries like India is because of two-wheelers. It is still not so much because of cars. And the behavior of two-wheeler, motorized two-wheeler is very different from four-wheeled motorized vehicles. And this is true both in rural and urban areas. So whether we talk about urban safety or we talk about intercity highways, this mix is going to be different. So that is why we have to see what is the transferability issue here. And of course, in general, we do find that poor quality of available studies, especially in the absence of high quality systematic reviews, is an issue we should watch out for. So I want to actually raise specific issues where this transferability becomes an issue. So look at, there are studies which have evaluated the impact of width of shoulders. What impact does it have on safety? And there are, so I'm quoting from Safety Cube. All these studies were included in our review also. Some of you may know about Safety Cube. This is a very extensive review which was done in Europe a couple of years ago. So in this is quote from Safety Cube. Several studies have found a positive effect of increasing shoulder width on road safety. So its road safety improves. However, for some circumstances, for example, injury and property damage only shoulder-related crashes have significant negative estimates. But what is important for us? The question is, first of all the studies which were included in Safety Cube are done in US, where I have already mentioned the traffic is different. And the year of the study and the evaluation methods are the core predictors of the overall estimates. There are more robust methods like empirical Bayes method which are used for understanding impacts. If we applied those methods, probably even these positive impacts would be less. But let's see, there are other issues involved here. These are some typical pictures most of you must be familiar with. Traffic mix on our highways. These are all highways. In the first picture, you see a pedestrian crossing over the fencing of this major 6-lane highway. Shoulder is being used by non-emergency vehicles. Often we find parked trucks there. And also by a lot of non-motorized vehicles. This is how highways are being used. This is typical 6-lane or 4-lane divided highways. So proportion of pedestrian fatality is ranging from 20 to 40%. And right lane is often used by heavy vehicles, so it's become a standard practice to overtake from the left side, which is the non-driver side. And these are all general issues. Now, before I get more detail, just a reminder that Rune Elvik's publication has already explained this. Anything, any intervention on the roads we do, or for traffic safety, it has two kinds of impacts on the road users. The first one is called the engineering effect, which we expect, and that is why we are doing that intervention. So if we have wider shoulders, that will give you more space for emergency maneuvers and vehicle recovery. So that makes perfect sense that we expect crashes to reduce. But what is behavioral adaptation? Because unlike inanimate physical objects, here we are dealing with human beings. And they are all the time adapting to what is happening on the road. If we have wider shoulders, wider lanes, it gives the impression to road user, you can drive faster. It is safe to drive faster. It's very comfortable to drive fast on wide roads. So behavioral adaptation of providing wide paved shoulder is higher speeds adopted by road users. So now we have higher speeds of motorized vehicles after doing wider shoulders. And on the shoulders, we have a lot of vulnerable road users present. They are exposed to higher speeds. But since we don't have good quality studies here to actually show you the result that it will lead to negative impacts, but we do have from our numbers that as we are expanding our highways and quote unquote improving, upgrading our highways, the rates are increasing and more pedestrians are getting killed on our highways. So these kind of things are very specific to some of our situation, which we have to relook very carefully and evaluate the impact. So another interesting, very important, I only wanted to raise two issues today, raised median. And systematically on all our upgraded highways, we have made raised median. And it is raised over 200 mm. Generally, it is much higher, 400 mm. And when we started looking at the literature, so all the current literature that we find in high-income countries, they are saying, yeah, it will actually create a barrier, you will avoid head-on collisions. So it seems it is going to have a positive impact. Installation of median has been shown to reduce number of road accidents on road segments with greatest effect on the most serious accidents because it is avoiding head-on collision. But what is interesting is that in these details, in these current studies which have been done in high-income countries, when we start looking at carefully what is the height they are talking about, it is never above 200 mm, always less. Why? Because the whole debate about raised median in high-income countries was settled in 70s. They never made those raised medians after that, and therefore you don't find those studies. So all these studies that we are talking about, US, Australia, Denmark, Norway, Germany, Malaysia, is talking about, not talking about high raised medians. This is what we find on our highways. Median is raised 200 or more. Raised medians are hazardous, leading to accidents. If you read the current AASHTO manual, it is very clear that we cannot have any raised medians on roads which have above 70 kilometers per hour, because when the motorized vehicle hits at that speed, it goes into an unpredictable trajectory. It just goes in the air. Trees, small structures, gantry signs, nothing should be on the median. This is the current understanding. Even our Indian Roads Congress code does not say that we should have raised median. So then you wonder, which code are we following? Here are some pictures of our new highways. You see how we have put the barrier? Any safety professional will tell you this is not the way it should be put. The detailing is absolutely wrong. So even when we are looking at crash barrier, the evidence we get from other countries is good. But however, how we are installing it here, we can't compare the two. The height is wrong, the installation detail is wrong. This is not a crash barrier. This is actually, we have created a hazard. Now we are showing you that it is above 200 mm, so even the height is wrong. This is the kind of booby traps. In 1975, Insurance Institute made a film called Booby Trap, where it actually documented what is happening on our roads, that we are planting things to make sure that people die. And after almost 70 years, we are still doing it. This is our new peripheral expressway outside Delhi. No standard will tell you that this is how the toll plazas have to be designed. Then, of course, you can say the driver was inattentive and tired and went and hit this concrete barrier. You remember, this picture is only a few days old. So there has been a lot of discussion on seat belts. But have we questioned why is the concrete wall there? A 3-lane road suddenly becomes a 2-lane road without any warning. Is it a question of only seatbelt? And you think that 4th September created a lot of discussion. I found a picture 6th September, Pune, where some students died. Our media is not talking about it. So the issue is this is happening every day. We just suddenly wake up because if some known person unfortunately meets this incident. I'm sure if we Google search today, we will find few more cases. Because we have created highways full of booby traps. So whose mistake is it? Is it only a question of seatbelt? Is it only a question of car design? I think as civil engineers, we have a lot to do. It is our responsibility. So just quoting this new publication, which came out in 22, where we were looking at, because this, Professor Mohan always, I think for last 20 years, he had been talking about raised medians. If you just look at some old publications. So finally, this study was done 2 years. I mean, he was also involved in this study. And when the studies were reviewed for this meta-analysis, the only 4 studies which met all the criteria for detailed discussion, 3 of them were related to raised median from US, and look at the years, 56, 62, and 72. Raised median question was settled after that. You don't make raised medians in high-speed roads. And there was only one study which talked about curb raised median, which was 96, so even that is not being done anymore. And in 2022, we are still doing it. AASHTO recommends vertical curb should never be used on high-speed facilities. So the risk posed by curbs to motorcyclists, which comprise more half of fatalities in LMICs, we have no knowledge about this at all. It's completely missing. So 93% of the fatalities which are happening in LMICs, majority are two-wheelers and pedestrians. We don't know the impact of this. So I think the way forward is like any other topic. Current knowledge of impact of infrastructure on road safety is limited to high-income countries. The physics is universal, but how it is being applied, we still have to understand and make sure that how it is working for us. Impact of shoulder design, median, service road, shoulder markings, audible markers, they have to be studied in countries like Africa, Asia, and LMICs where the traffic is similar. Impact evaluation studies should be made mandatory for all investments. I mean, we have huge road expansion program going on in all these countries. But we don't know we are not doing scientific evaluation of those interventions. And new infrastructure standards have to evolve based on new knowledge and production. So we keep borrowing, even in Indian Roads Congress, we keep borrowing standards done in other countries, but we still don't have that whole protocol set that we have done something, let's spend next 3 years evaluating this and come back to IRC and revise it. I think all these things are required. So as a research community, I think we have a huge responsibility. and a huge task in front of us, especially for the younger people. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. So we had two very interesting presentations. A first one on legal and institutional framework. So while going through the presentation, I was thinking, like the Motor Vehicle Act has been very stringent. There are the fines amount have been enhanced. So it's time to know, like, is it really helping? So that was a question which was coming. And Dr. Agarwal talked about, like, who is going to do the study? Can you do all the studies in the transportation group of civil department or the interdisciplinary centers? But I believe more than that, it is high time that other academic departments within the university, higher education, also show interest to address, say, these kind of issues, to provide their inputs for these kind of studies. Of late, we have seen there is like a lot of enthusiasm in terms of speed regulation. Merit Expressway, we heard about the moment you cross 80 or the moment you cross 100, you get automatic challan. So is it really helping those kind of enforcement system? Or, I mean, all of a sudden, why the speed is just regulated? I mean, are there any other elements which needs to be regulated? In fact, I'll open up this thing, I mean, for the question answer session. Second part, Professor Tiwari talked about the road infrastructure design and traffic management. In fact, I'll say that probably the last 2 decades we have constructed. Right now, I mean, everybody takes pride. What is the kilometer of road we are constructing every day? But at the same time, I believe last decade there has been many changes in IRC documents, especially with respect to non-motorized transport. The inputs of the various studies, the inputs of the experts working in this area has come into some of the document, but how effective they are, definitely there can be specific studies which can look at. And the audience has many young researchers. I know they are very passionate about it, and both the presentations has set the tone to understand, identify the agenda which needs to be taken forward. So with that small note, I open it to the entire audience. We can take the question answer.
This is a question for Professor Agarwal. In the 4 risk factors, I was just curious, is sort of child restraint considered within the safe seat belts? Is that where that's included? And I didn't see anything on distracted driving. Is that something that's emerging as something, because there's been a lot of talk about whether that's really contributing to that? And whether the impact or the behavior on speed also includes rash driving. I don't know where that sort of comes in. Is overspeeding the only infraction, or does rash driving also sort of constitute other behaviors, and is there any evidence around that?
So, for the first part of your question, when we said seat belts, that includes all internal restraints, right? So we weren't calling out airbags necessarily separate from seat belts, and most studies do not. Right? At least off the top of my head, I cannot think of a study that's talking of seat belts and not bringing airbags into the picture, because most of these systems are designed to work together. Neither is supposed to be independent. As for rash driving, I think that's a question Geetam can answer better, that why certain aspects were included, why they were not. That whether speed, that under speed, did we distinguish between rash driving or just exceeding the speed limit or not? So actually, let me take a back at, yeah, Geetam can correct me if I'm wrong, that, remember, these are not, we weren't doing research in what makes a difference or not, right? We're just looking at what other people have done, right? And the parameters that were used were something that if somebody is talking of rash driving, they would be talking of excess speed. Right? So the idea was sort it out on this. If, let's say, we had ended up with 4,000 papers from talking about speed limits from a legal and policy point of view, yes, then we may have done a second set of review to break them down further. Right? I hope that answers your questions. No, not specifically under, because at least I'll answer for law and policy, not under law and policy. Right? How am I ever going to have a law that says, be focused on your driving, don't let anything distract you? Right? You can do indirect proxies. You can say that, okay, no cell phone. Right? We did not look for that as a specific thing.
My name is Brinda Singh, and I'm not in the sector, so to speak, but I'm a very dear friend of Dinesh and Peggy. I was wondering, in the sense of how much hard work all of you have done for so many years in this area, and how concerned all of us are who drive about safety issues and see the number of 93% fatalities of non-motorized is really scary. Well, not cars, I think that was what the figure was. My question really is, are there any happy stories about where your research and your work has been able to make some headroads in policy? Because even today in a place like Delhi, just the Chirag-Delhi flyover today is getting about, I don't know, almost 1 foot high meridians on that flyover, for example. And so is there any state in India which has been able to take on board people from your departments or people who've done research and put them into policy and implement? Because for me, unless that is happening, it is a very pathetic and sad story, and you go on spending so much energy, and to what end? Thank you.
So should I give a quick answer to this? Actually, you mentioned partly also. So I think, it's always how you look at the glass, half full or half empty. Some things do make difference. And I think as academics and researchers, our job is to keep doing our work. Where it has found a difference, actually Professor Parida mentioned, after a lot of discussion and heated discussion in Indian Roads Congress committees, many documents have been changed. And as I was showing also that even in Indian Roads Congress document, it does not say that you should make raised medians. I think now the next step is that we start actually questioning the people who are doing it. Which standard are you following? So, in fact, 2 years back, ministry also sent out a notification that how I was pointing, the wrong design of the crash barrier, how it's been installed. They have actually notified that this is not how it should be done. And they have given some details which have been included in IRC documents also now. So many IRC documents are under revision. I think where the work we do, the work our other academic colleagues are doing is slowly getting into it. But I completely agree with you, the process is too slow because still what I see around happening in Delhi, this is interesting because even in Delhi, if you see what is called UTPEC guidelines, it does not tell you the road should be designed the way what we are doing. So you do wonder at some point that which standard people are following. And this is a big question mark. I mean, I think it's a question of governance. Probably we should talk in the last session also. Certain things exist, but it takes a long time to really see its correct implementation and impact. And I guess India is not a unique country in that sense. Probably this is the experience in many other countries also. Except that now we are living in 21st century. We have a lot of information available to us. Hopefully it should be expedited, but I don't see that happening. Yeah, that's another, Girish is reminding me that something that Dinesh had started talking about in mid-90s, making legislation for mandatory daytime running lights for two-wheelers. It has become a law now. All new motorcycles come, when you turn on the ignition, that headlight comes on. And that actually, scientific studies have shown reduction of 20% in motorcycle deaths with that. So I think things are happening slowly, but surely they are happening. I think we should be optimistic.
My question is to Professor Tiwari. You had told that you had carried out a evidence gap map for road infrastructure design and control, and you found most of the research is carried out in high-income countries. What criteria used and to gather the studies that we have done less research in low-income countries, and you had also pointed out that it could be that we are doing the quality of our studies are not up to the mark. So what you suggest for young researchers like that, what you expect us from like quality research?
So in this particular project that we did, evidence gap map, there is a very specific protocol that we work out, which is also published. So very carefully you work out what study designs will give you definitive results, which can be included. And there are many studies we cannot include because they were simulation studies or they did not measure the outcome. We were looking at only 5 outcomes. It should have shown impact on fatalities, on injuries, on speed reduction. These 3 were relevant for infrastructure, but then the other were for other topics: helmet use, alcohol, drinking and driving, and seatbelt. So if the studies that we were looking at did not meet either the study design criteria or the outcome criteria, then we could not include it. And the study design criteria basically ensures that it is what is called robust study. That it, sometimes, as I was quoting Ezra Howard, it's very easy to do naive before and after study. You do something, and 6 months later you go and see, or 1 year later you see whether the number of deaths have decreased, or what is the impact on number of fatalities. But if you understand the field, you will realize that 1 year does not give you any confirmed evidence. For fatalities, we have to wait for 3 to 5 years because any change can happen even without doing any intervention. So there are a lot of these detailed kind of issues which are important. So I think as young researchers, now we really have to spend time on what is good, what kind of data we use, data quality is important, and what study designs we are using. And some study designs have been mentioned, but in your own coursework you will find more robust study designs used by public health professionals is slowly coming into this field also, which should be used more often. Case control, case crossover, etc.
Yes, this question is for both the presenters. Do we have any law that controls land use along the expressways or national highways currently in India? Because if you see, most of the roadside activity that was shown in the pictures is related to the new activity that is coming up once the highways are constructed.
Our focus was looking at safety outcomes, right? So we weren't really looking at land use per se. But to answer your question, no, once land is acquired, a right-of-way is defined for what constitutes the highway. The physical highway or roadway may be smaller than the right-of-way. So within the right-of-way, nominally usage is controlled, right? But realistically, how are you going to do that? If you look at, say, one of the newer highways in the NCR area, right, the Meerut highway that takes off from the Nizamuddin bridge area and then goes straight, right? It's designed mostly as an elevated highway as it goes through Ghaziabad and points between Ghaziabad and Delhi with a lot of side roads, right? Every 200, 300 meters on that highway, there's a big sign, the symbolic signs, which says no two-wheelers, right? There is no enforcement done on that, and very correctly, I use that highway fairly regularly, and just again, anecdotally, about 1/4 of the traffic on that highway is motorcycles and scooters and auto rickshaws, right? How are you going to control that when you built a highway through a community? People who were using those roads before still need to use that, right? Yes, it basically brings in a lot of risk that was not there before, right?
That's a design fault. That's not the fault of the people riding the motorbike on the highway. They still have to go there. You've taken away the road and put a highway there, not their fault, right? So the whole issue of land use control around the highways, right? Sort of, most of our public debate usually is from the wrong angle on that, right? Because we are looking at trying to control it. But really the fault is in the imagination of how and why the highway was made, how it was designed and built, right? You cannot be building little conduits to carry people in isolation, ignoring everything that is around there. Same thing for those of you who are long-time NCR residents. If you look at the eastern peripheral, eastern western peripheral, right? It's a masterpiece of how not to build a highway. Virtually everything on that is wrong, right? And you can have all the laws in the world that talk about speed limits and access things. It's not going to happen, right? So that highway gets used for all the young men in villages training for the army, right? So they marked out tracks. It's used for panchayat meetings. People bring out khatiyas on the side, sit on it, right? There were lots of ramps cut on the side for people going from one side to the other. There were informal toll gates, somebody sitting on a charpai with a lakdi ka thing raising up and down to cross, right? It's all illegal nominally, right? But then it's also illegal to build the curves they did and the way they put the crash barriers, if you look at what the regulations are and what the purpose is. So the land use question is very fraught, right? What is land use? Who defines it, right? The whole idea of defining a right of way and saying nothing but the highway there does not work. It didn't even work in the US where it originated, right? They keep modifying highway access issues, right of way issues. Right? Trying to impose that in India is a non-starter from the beginning.
It's a reflection on a topic you have covered in your presentations with regards the lack of information on the publications regarding the how did the interventions happen wherever they were being implemented and evaluated. And I'm asking this because of Geetam's role as co-editor in one of the journals, and we have the editor in the room. I wonder, is there any room to create a guideline that anyone reporting a peer-reviewed paper has to have a section on the how? I think that would be a good incentive for all of us to be a little bit more clear as to what are the nuts and bolts of the intervention that we are reporting on, and that would ease the transferability concern that you have raised during your talks. Just a thought.
Okay. Thank you for the fascinating discussion. One, I guess a common thread which might hold across all the different sessions is the outcomes themselves, and I know a lot of work has been done at Trip Center and other researchers about the reliability of crash data in India. So how much of that when developing the evidence gap map is also factoring, given that, we mentioned fatal and injury, and a lot of the studies themselves say that the injury outcomes are not, there's a lot of underreporting. So to what end does the research that is being discussed and the quality of the research is getting hampered by the outcome itself? Because if that is not available, then the analysis on the impact of the interventions also becomes difficult to evaluate. And the related aspect in terms of the institutional frameworks, I know there are a lot of changes happening in terms of developing newer databases. To what end are the design of those keeping in mind developing more evidence-based results? I know that a lot of the data sets that get generated end up being very difficult to obtain to do analysis. So any comments on that?
So the first one, in our outcomes when we were looking at, that's why we did treat fatal and injury separately. Because you remember we've always had this discussion that don't mix the two. Level of underreporting is everywhere, but there is underreporting of non-fatal crashes. But injury crashes are important. And I think, Maria, you want to, in the new global report, we are trying to actually include injury crashes also, but the underreporting remains a huge problem anyway. Anyway, I think sometimes people try to solve that problem by doing some other studies and understanding the level of underreporting, because then at least you have some numbers to work with. No, EGM, that's why we looked at separate outcomes. Fatal is separate from injury. And so that's all we could do in EGM, because remember in EGM, right now we haven't really gone into the details of evidence. But when we are looking at the outcomes, we are including that either people have worked with the same set of data and have reported fatal outcomes and non-fatal outcomes. And your second question was about this whole effort of making these standardized databases. So I will specifically talk about India. I think your question is more alluded to India, because in many other places this question is kind of solved. So here our latest effort is that IRAD. And we have been discussing this with many NHAI professionals also, people who are supposed to upload a lot of information in that. I think it's a good start, but we have to wait and watch what happens in the next few years. Right now, it is still asking for too many details for all crashes, and just creating very reliable fatal crash data doesn't seem to be the national priority, at least. But the whole effort is to make this. All I can say right now is we have to wait and watch. We have to wait for a few years to see what level of reporting we are able to do, recording and reporting.
Okay. Yes, Professor Tiwari, very heart-touching presentation by you. So as you have rightly said that in order to do the impact assessment, we only cannot do for naive before and after study, like simple before and after study. Now, when we go for more scientific method like empirical base and other things, so I have seen from your publication that like it is very difficult to develop safety performance function for like overall India or maybe for a particular state, or like development of the over dispersion parameter that they use for those method. Now, as Professor Parida is here and he is going to be the next director of CRRI, so can academic institution can come forward and take up some like multi-institutional project on Indo-Highway Safety Manual, so that we can share data across all the institution and come up with safety performance function, crash modification factor, crash reduction factor, and go for some scientific method to see the impacts of different road infrastructure and make some modification to the ministry, like recommendation to the ministry, and see some changes or modification on our roads. This is my question as well as the comments.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very good idea. CRRI had taken a lead in doing HCM. And I remember in 2012, we did have this discussion with your then director that why don't we include safety also as part of it? But at that time, I think the priority was to look at other aspects. I guess it is high time that we do take up, like it has been done in many other HCMs. Safety has been included now. So we should get into this, as you're suggesting, multi-institutional project, sharing data and working on this. Maybe you can.
So that discussion is currently going on, but for this year, Ministry has identified already the projects, but separately we can put it up to the Director General, and the discussion definitely can be taken ahead. That's true. I think maybe just one last intervention.
I'll just take 1 minute. Firstly, thank you very much. Wonderful learning sessions going on since morning. I just want to, as no question, an observation which I noticed during my recent studies. Though we brush aside that behavior is affected by many other things, but even in this case which we were just discussing in the morning, the lady who was driving was at 138 km per hour as per the initial reports. May not be correct. And she had been already 2-3 times violated this over speed. She has been booked. So that remains a behavior thing. Similarly, if I stay in Gurgaon, there is a highway very recently, Sona highway has been made. There is a passage through which pedestrian or two-wheelers can cross. But the pedestrian is still, I've seen many ladies crossing the highway. They jump on it, they cross, they do not travel even 50 meters. So this behavior issue still remains. And in the morning I was listening Dr. Matthew, he raised a valid point that this behavior issue requires some social research things. So are we doing something on this? We can do something, we can motivate the drivers to drive good. We did a research on some 10,000 transport drivers for past 6 months. We started scoring their driving pattern and using an IoT converted into something called safe driving score. It's something like a civil score for financial transactions. And people are now very careful about their civil score because they always take some credit or they are more careful than bouncing of a check, which is a cognizable offense. So similarly, if we create something like this, safe driving score, which is linked to their driving license, and that gives visibility how skilled this driver is, probably these things may be helpful. I mean, more research can be done on this, so we can think of.
I think I would like to react here. Professor Mohan had a classic quote in this, and he would say, you tell your child to behave in a particular manner, and the child does not behave that way. Would you want your child to be injured or killed because of that? If your answer to this question is no, then everyone on the road who is there, consciously or unconsciously, does a mistake, does not deserve to be injured or dead. No way. So the Swedish Vision Zero looks at forgiving environments. Human beings are human beings. They may make mistakes, but we don't want them to be injured seriously, maimed or killed because of that mistake. Therefore, we do not look at safety from the behavior perspective, but we look at safety from the environment that is unsafe. That is it.
No, that's good.
Let me add. I'll add a couple of things to what you said. Some work that Kavi and I did about 6-7 years ago, right? Looking at using, all phones have built-in accelerometers and things, using that along with some software to see how drivers behave in a given area. This was starting from Greater Noida to Delhi, using some university drivers who drive that regularly, faculty who drive occasionally, people who follow random routes. Right? And every driver, irrespective of the length of driving, whether they were professionally driving themselves, their behavior was controlled by the morphology of the areas they were passing through. If they went through a village on a narrow road where there was a blind turn, they all sped up because they wanted to cross that before somebody entered from the other side, right? So the geometry was the primary influencer. What was the signage, what were the road conditions is what controlled how people drove. They weren't just somebody speeding away would not do that in every condition. Every driver does that. Anecdotally, I like to point out that how is it that the same Indian driver, right, when they go to another country in the space of a week, they're driving like everybody else around them. They did not magically acquire new skills in a week, right? So it's the surrounding environment which predominantly controls how people drive. And the second part of when you said that Why wouldn't the ladies walk 50 meters? Why should they? Why is the car there? I mean, look at the history. 100 years ago, the big fights in cities were, why are we allowing these smoke-belching monstrosities to take up our streets? Never forget that roads are meant for people. They're not meant for cars. Cars are an intrusion on roads. So primary thing is pedestrians. Right? Make a way for cars to go around it. Why should cars be given primacy and pedestrians made to go into khaddas or go over bridges? Right? If you start thinking of it from that perspective, it changes your view of what road safety means, how roads should be designed.
Yeah. So that's the last intervention. Yeah.
I hope so. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. My question is related to Motor Vehicle Amendment Act, because the Act says that there is a provision that road contractors can be penalized or charged or fined for the faulty road design. So my question is, I would like to seek your personal view. How do you see it? Although it may be too early to discuss on this because state governments are yet to notify the rules, but how do you see that? What will be the repercussions? Will it be helpful in Indian context, or will it be really we will have difficulties in it? So how do you see that?
Our answer is zero effect. I don't need to wait for data for that because the fine is minuscule compared to what a road costs. Right? That fine is less than the average bribe they're paying per kilometer. Right? It's the equivalent of, see, there's certain conditions where fines work. Certain they don't. They don't work in motor vehicle situations because I wasn't leaving home planning to speed around a corner or planning to run a red light. Right? But when I'm making a road, everything is planned, right? It's the equivalent of this is deviating from the topic, but I said death penalty should only be reserved for financial crimes. Because if there's something premeditated, that is, right? So, but leaving that aside, no. I don't think, one, the fines are too small. Two, who's going to decide? There's this whole issue of what are the criteria that the project is unsafe, right? Who says it is unsafe? Are we going to put into contracts detailed definitions of what makes something unsafe? You cannot post facto come in and say, because an accident happened, your project was bad. Where does liability rest? Who's the designer? Who's the builder? Who was the site engineer? Who had control on different aspects, right? So unless we change the whole way roadway contracting is done, I think it's a public relations exercise saying there'll be a fine, right? Because just in deciding that fine is a near impossibility under circumstances.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
I think
Thank you
with that we can close the session. We had two interesting EGM studies which were presented. We started with the legal and institutional framework. There is a lot to be studied and a lot of opportunities to be studied with the kind of interventions which are taking place. And to question whether seat belt suddenly becomes important, speed regulation suddenly becomes important, how to identify those things. In fact, Dr. Agarwal talked about the road user pricing. So that is one thing. In fact, if you look at the toll rates all across the country, it's a uniform rate. Suppose there is a particular corridor, you are putting safety interventions, high-end safety interventions. Who should pay for that? There are different kind of users. Maybe you can assign the responsibility. Can the usage be deducted from them? So yes, definitely those questions, they need to be answered. Professor Tiwari talked about infrastructure. In fact, obviously I have seen her in the last 2 decades. IRC ministry, they have always been scared when she makes the presentation. That's probably one of the reasons the codes, documents have absorbed, but then whether on the ground they have been implemented. The pedestrian code was, the last code was in 2012, the present code took 10 years to be revised. So the process is a little bit slow. But last one comment I would like to make, in fact, I have known that Professor Dinesh Mohan was talking about, say, school school bus safety. Means maybe sometimes in 70s that all the buses, they need to be painted yellow. And I think all our school buses were painted yellow post the Wazirabad school bus accident, where closely 74 school children died. So ma'am was asking about the happy research situation. To respond to that, research definitely plays, but only thing is that our willpower to implement. So whatever efforts, like especially the EGM study, the points that they have identified, we have very young, passionate researchers in the area of safety, those who are here, and I'm sure they will take those agenda. And certainly it's a slow process, only thing, because we are worried that the total number of accidents, 4 lakhs, why it's not coming down, that's the larger question. But I'm sure these kind of studies, these interventions will go a long way in curbing the overall the menace of road accidents in the country. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you both the speakers. I think one is a techno-legal mind, that is Girish. Another is the expert in the infrastructure and the technical details. I guess, I think there is one point that has been made as a passing mention. The codes are being revised and all that. I was fortunate to be a part of a few codes here and there, but you'll be very shocked to know that there is no budget allocated for revising the codes. It's on a voluntary basis. We force our students. Sometimes we pay, we don't pay, and they, with a lot of grouse and grudge, they do it. But I think the larger message is, I think even, I was shocked even to know that BIS codes are done in the same way, which we think is a holy grail. I look at my phone and say, oh, BIS marked, it's good. But unfortunately, there is not much work or there is not much budget allocated to see that these are the standards which are good. I don't know about other countries, but these are with my limited observations and being part of one of the codes, this is the thing. So my request to the policymakers all around here, particularly I think Professor Parida, who you will be taking over as a director, you also, I would like you to urge the ministry and other agencies enabling to allocate budgets whereby the codes can be developed in the true sense and which can really be implementable and which are real, rather than drawing from eclectic sources and then we're saying that as a code. Thank you, and thank you, Professor Parida, for giving us some useful insights on the talks.